The air in the high-frequency trading war room of Sinclair Capital was thick with the scent of overpriced espresso, damp winter coats, and the low, constant mechanical hum of server racks vibrating through the floorboards. It was 9 in the morning on a gray, drizzling Monday in Manhattan. The cold rain was streaking against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, blurring the yellow cabs crawling down Park Avenue like tiny beetles. I sat near the far end of the long mahogany table, my fingers resting on the cold aluminum case of my laptop. My name is Gerald Vance. I am 54 years old and my face is the kind of quiet, weathered face that junior analysts walk past in the corridor without seeing. My job title, Senior Data Strategist, was designed to sound dry and forgettable, a bureaucratic label to keep headhunters from calling. But everyone who actually worked on the floor knew the truth. I was the person who built the core predictive trading algorithm that kept this entire investment house from collapsing into a smoking heap of debt. I had been at Sinclair Capital for 11 years. I started back when the firm ran its operations out of a cramped, drafty office in Tribeca that smelled like cold pizza and wet wool. Now, we had 4 floors of glass and steel in one of the most expensive zip codes in the country, and a boardroom with an expensive hand-woven rug that cost more than a junior analyst's annual salary. But the fundamental nature of the work remained the same. I was the silent guardian of their capital. I had designed Sentinel, the proprietary trading oracle that the partners now treated like a divine gift. They talked about Sentinel in investor webinars as if it were a magical autonomous entity that whispered profitable numbers from the heavens. But it was not magic. It was 11 years of my life, chronic insomnia, and roughly 200,000 lines of highly complex, custom code. I was the only person on Earth who fully understood its mathematical limits. And then came the strategic legacy transition. That was the polite corporate term the board used to describe how the founder of the firm, George Sinclair, who was 63 years old, had decided to retire to his beach house in Florida. He handed the keys of the castle to his 27-year-old son, Julian Sinclair. Julian was fresh out of an expensive Ivy League business school, stuffed with inherited ego, and smelled of too much sandalwood cologne. He strutted into our Monday morning all-hands meeting in suede loafers with no socks, acting like he was about to host a private party in the Hamptons. He tossed out empty buzzwords like digital velocity, investor captivation, and machine learning synergy like he was throwing cheap confetti to a crowd. I was mid-presentation, explaining a slide that showed a volatility curve spike in the trading model due to synthetic leverage signals in the European bond market. I was trying to warn him that the algorithm was showing signs of extreme structural instability under these new parameters. Julian cut me off with a smirk that could curdle milk. He tapped his polished fingernail on my slide deck, looked around the room to make sure the other partners were watching, and said he did not pay me to think. He told me the algorithm worked fine and that I needed to stop trying to tweak it. He said he just needed me to keep the lights on and let the machine make money without asking philosophical questions. The room fell completely silent. I could feel every eye in the room pivot toward me. The junior traders stopped typing. The compliance officers stared at their paper cups. They were waiting to see how the veteran strategist would react. Would I raise my voice, argue, or storm out? No, I did not give them the drama they wanted. I just nodded, closed my laptop screen slowly, and let the click of the latch echo in the quiet room. Vengeance is a dish best served cold, and I had already started freezing the ingredients. By 2 in the afternoon, my resignation letter was typed, printed on plain white paper, and placed in a manila envelope along with my security badge. I did not use the company letterhead. I did not write a long speech or thank them for the opportunity. I just wrote 2 sentences stating that I was resigning effective immediately. The human resources representative was so checked out, she did not even ask for an exit interview. She stamped the paper, filed it in her database, and handed me my personal item box without looking up from her screen. As I walked out of the glass tower on Park Avenue, the autumn air felt crisp and clean against my face. Behind me, upstairs on the trading floor, Julian was reportedly telling the team that I was out of my depth and could not handle the modern, fast-paced environment. He thought he had flushed a relic down the drain. He had no idea that he had just removed the only set of brakes on a train that was already gathering speed toward a cliff. I got into a yellow cab, took a deep breath, and finally smiled. I sat in the quiet study of my apartment that evening, the soft blue light of my personal computer casting long, thin shadows across the bookshelves. I poured myself a double glass of neat bourbon, listening to the ice melt, and looked at my private cloud archive. To understand the collapse that was coming to Sinclair Capital, you have to understand how Sentinel actually worked. The firm believed the algorithm was a fully autonomous, plug-and-play trading oracle. That was the false narrative Julian was pitching to investors. But it was a lie. The market is a chaotic, breathing beast, and no machine can navigate it without constant human guidance. Sentinel was elegant, but it relied on a set of manual adjustments that I applied every week. I had built a separate file called Failover Manual Version 3 Final Docax. It was a harmless-sounding document, but it contained the hand-tuned threshold corrections and volatility dampeners that kept the algorithm from spiraling when the data got noisy. It was my invisible hand on the wheel. Without those manual overrides, the algorithm would slowly drift, misinterpreting market anomalies as real trends. I had kept these tools on my personal cloud drive because the firm refused to fund the infrastructure to integrate them into the core system. I stared at the file on my screen. I did not write a virus, and I did not hack their servers. That would be illegal, and I am a man of law. I simply deleted my personal file from my private archive. I watched the file vanish from the backup drive. I had no obligation to provide free maintenance to a company that did not respect my mind. The machine was now running on its own, coasting on the memory of my last update. It would work for a week, maybe two, but the moment the market shifted, the lack of brakes would show. Meanwhile, Julian was busy rebranding the system. He renamed it the Aegis platform, ordered customized mugs for the staff, and hosted webinars, claiming the system was a proprietary breakthrough requiring no human intervention. He told the board that the old team had been too conservative, holding back the firm's true potential. In his pursuit of higher returns, Julian did something incredibly reckless. He disabled the minor volatility throttles I had embedded in the system, calling them legacy safeguards that slowed down execution. He cut the latency buffer between signal generation and trade execution, allowing the system to place $4 billion in trades per click without waiting for data verification. I watched the initial ripples from my balcony. I had set up a simple alert script on a private sandbox server that monitored public trading logs. Within 10 days, the anomalies began. One index fund underweighted a major semiconductor. Holding on a day, it posted record profits. A leveraged fund dumped positions at 3:14 in the morning for no apparent reason. Then came the text message. It was from Toby Fletcher, a junior quant analyst I had mentored for 3 years. Toby was smart, dedicated, and far too loyal to a firm that did not value him. He sent a screenshot of the Aegis trade log, asking if the output looked normal. The algorithm had flagged a heavy short position on a major national defense stock during a live press briefing where the government announced increased military contracts. Aegis was trading against the news, doubling down on a losing position. It was echo chamber logic, the exact feedback loop I had warned about in the documentation that Julian had deleted on his first day. I did not text him back. I could not save them from their own arrogance. I closed my phone and let the silence fill the room. The study in my apartment was a sanctuary of order. The walls were lined with books on quantitative finance, mathematics, and classical history. I had spent years of my life inside this room, working late into the night to resolve database deadlocks and system latency issues for Sinclair Capital. The drive to make Sentinel perfect had been all-consuming. I had built the algorithm with the belief that it would be my legacy, a testament to my career as a systems architect. Now, looking at the private cloud archive, I felt a deep sense of detachment. The loyalty I had shown to the firm had been met with condescension and public embarrassment. The file Failover Manual Version 3, Final Docs, was the result of 3 years of monitoring. I had analyzed market anomalies, identifying the specific patterns that caused the trading models to lose stability. I had written custom thresholds that would automatically scale back leverage when confidence intervals fell below 95%. These were not part of the standard release because Julian had dismissed them as unnecessary limitations that cut into profit margins. He wanted the machine to run at full capacity, regardless of market volatility. By deleting this file, I was not sabotaging their system. I was simply removing my personal work. I was taking my hands off the wheel and letting the vehicle run on its own. If it crashed, it was because the driver chose to disable the brakes. The next few days were a lesson in executive hubris. Julian went on a media tour, bragging about the firm's new autonomous platform. He gave interviews to blogs, speaking about how it would revolutionize the industry by removing human bias. He smiled for the cameras while the machine was slowly beginning to drift. The minor volatility throttles I had embedded were the only things keeping it stable, and by removing them, he had opened the door to a feedback loop that would consume the firm's capital. I watched the logs on my screen, noting the rising divergence. It was like watching a slow-motion collapse, and I was the only spectator who knew the ending. By the third week, the warning lights inside Sinclair Capital were flashing red, though Julian was too busy planning his next investor dinner to notice. The junior analysts were starting to panic. Toby Fletcher tried to raise the issue through formal channels, submitting a report showing that the volatility metrics were diverging from reality. Julian dismissed the report, telling Toby to chill and explaining that the market was simply unpredictable. He was more concerned with matching the floral centerpieces at the Peninsula Hotel dinner to the firm's new color scheme than looking at trade logs. From my new office 10 blocks north and 30 floors higher, I watched the rot spread. I had joined Zenith Capital as their new principal developer, working in a quiet space where the executive management actually read my documentation and said please and thank you. The contrast was night and day. Here, my 54 years of experience were treated as an asset, not a liability. I was paid to think, and my team respected the boundaries I set, but the ghost of my old work still lingered. One evening, Toby met me at a diner near Grand Central. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling as he held his coffee mug. He told me that compliance was starting to hover around the trading desk, asking for the system logs and the safety audit sign-offs for the second quarter. The firm was preparing to close a massive new capital round from a group of Swiss investors, and the legal department needed to certify that the algorithm had been fully vetted. Toby leaned across the table and whispered that they had found the signed compliance certification in the corporate portal. It bore my name and my digital signature, dated 15 days after my resignation. My blood went cold. I had signed no such document. I had left the firm weeks before that audit was even compiled. I asked Toby if he could secure the metadata of that compliance upload. The next morning, he emailed me an encrypted file containing the system logs. I opened it on my personal machine, away from any corporate network. The audit logs did not lie. The digital signature on the certification had been forged using my old administrator token, which had been copied from a shared training drive. The handshake logs showed the file was uploaded from an internet protocol address matching Julian Sinclair's corporate laptop at 4 in the morning. He had forged my signature to satisfy the Swiss investors and bypass the regulatory safety checks. Under California Penal Code Section 470, forging a digital signature on a compliance audit to secure investor funds is a felony. More importantly, it meant the entire regulatory filing was fraudulent. Under the law, any contract signed under such false pretenses was void ab initio, void from the beginning. Julian had not just made a technical mistake, he had committed securities fraud to cover up his own incompetence. I saved the metadata, the timestamps, and the forgery evidence to an encrypted flash drive. The trap was set, and Julian had walked right into it. The Zenith Capital offices were a stark contrast to the chaotic environment of my former employer. Located on the upper floors of a modern tower, the space was quiet, clean, and organized. The development team was composed of experienced engineers who understood the value of code documentation and peer review. My new manager, a seasoned systems architect who had spent 20 years in the industry, welcomed me with genuine respect. On my first day, he handed me a cup of coffee and told me that my role was to think, to analyze, and to build the next generation of their platform. There were no empty buzzwords, no sockless loafers, and no condescending smirks. I felt a sense of peace that I had not felt in years, but the situation at Sinclair Capital was never far from my mind, largely due to Toby's occasional messages. When we met at the diner, the noise of the city seemed to fade into the background. Toby told me that the firm was desperate to secure the new capital from the Swiss group. The Swiss investors had demanded a full audit of the algorithm's safety parameters after hearing rumors of the database anomalies. Julian had been unable to answer their technical questions, and in his panic, he had turned to my old files. Finding that the safety certifications were outdated, he had made the decision to forge my signature on a retrospective sign-off. The discovery of the forgery changed everything. It was no longer just a story of corporate politics and bad management. It was now a matter of criminal law. California Penal Code Section 470 is very clear about the penalties for forgery, especially when it involves financial compliance and investor disclosures. By signing my name to a document I had never seen, Julian had exposed himself to federal prosecution. He had also compromised the firm's legal standing. Any contract signed with the Swiss investors based on a forged compliance document was void ab initio, meaning it had no legal force from the very beginning. The Swiss group would be legally entitled to demand the immediate return of their capital, and the firm would have no defense. I saved the log files, the session tokens, and the IP addresses onto my encrypted drive, knowing that this was the final piece of the puzzle. The storm broke on a Monday morning at exactly 9:17. The market opened to heavy volatility, driven by rumors of federal interest rate shifts, and the Aegis algorithm, running without its manual thresholds, misread a complex sequence of signals. It initiated a massive, high-leverage short position on a semiconductor giant just minutes before the company announced surprise multi-billion-dollar defense contract. The stock soared instantly, launching upward like a SpaceX rocket and leaving the firm's trading desk completely exposed because Julian had disabled the latency buffers and safety throttles to chase millisecond advantages. Aegis did not stop to verify the data. It read the sudden price spike as statistical noise and automatically amplified its short position by another 40%, trying to force the market to bend to its algorithm's internal logic. Within 7 minutes, the firm's primary trading account lost $9,300,000. By 10 in the morning, the losses had compounded to $21 million. The trading floor was in a state of complete, unmitigated chaos. Senior traders were shouting at the screens, phones were ringing off the hook with calls from alarmed prime brokers, and one junior analyst reportedly threw up in his desk trash can from the sheer panic. Julian emerged from the executive suite, his face pale and his linen blazer wrinkled. He tried to blame the development team, claiming that Toby Fletcher had miscalibrated the systems. He called in expensive external consultants, paying them $1,200 an hour to analyze the logs, but they could only confirm what I already knew. The system was in a terminal loop. Across town, I sat on my quiet balcony, watching the market ticker on my iPad while sipping a cup of black coffee. Vengeance does not need to yell. It is most effective when it is executed with cold mathematical precision. I logged into an encrypted Proton Mail account I hadn't used in over a year and drafted a message to the Securities and Exchange Commission's Enforcement Division. I did not write a long, emotional narrative about how I had been insulted or dismissed. I simply attached the public investor brief, where Julian claimed the algorithm was fully autonomous, alongside the forensic metadata and IP logs proving he had forged my signature on the second quarter safety audits to secure the Swiss capital. Because the compliance filing was forged, the contract with the Swiss investors was void ab initio. The firm had no legal right to hold their funds, and the regulators would be forced to freeze their assets immediately. I hit send, closed my laptop, and went back to my coffee. Within 2 hours, the news hit the terminals. Bloomberg broke the story first. Aegis trading model triggers $80 million loss in second quarter catastrophe. CNBC followed, reporting that federal regulators had launched an immediate investigation into Sinclair Capital for securities fraud and compliance violations. The Swiss investors pulled their capital faster than the firm could process the requests, triggering a margin call that threatened to bankrupt the entire operation. The tower on Park Avenue was leaning, and the foundation was completely gone. The panic on the trading floor at Sinclair Capital was described to me later by Toby in vivid detail. When the semiconductor giant's contract was announced, the stock price jumped by 30% in a matter of seconds. The automated systems, hardwired to trust the Aegis platform, began executing short trades to defend the position, believing that the price spike was a temporary anomaly. Because the latency buffers had been removed, the system was executing thousands of trades per second, compounding the losses with every tick of the clock. The traders stood around the terminal, paralyzed, while the red numbers on the dashboard climbed into the millions. Julian's reaction was a study in panic. He did not know how to shut down the automated trading desks because he had never taken the time to learn the system architecture. He stood in the middle of the room, shouting at the developers to fix it, while the consultants he had hired stood by, unable to override the core logic without the master key. The external consultants were experts in theory, but they had no understanding of the custom integration layers I had built over 11 years. They were simply charging their hourly rate to watch the firm bleed capital. I watched the market data from my balcony, enjoying the quiet morning. The decision to send the tip to the Securities and Exchange Commission was not born out of anger. It was a logical correction. The firm was operating on a lie, claiming to own a fully autonomous system while using a forged signature to bypass federal regulations. The regulators responded with surprising speed, sending an emergency notice to the firm's legal department and freezing the Swiss capital. The Bloomberg headline was the beginning of the end. Within hours, the firm's reputation was destroyed, and the investors were scrambling to withdraw their funds before the regulators stepped in. The house of cards that Julian had built on his father's name was collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. By Friday morning, the silence at Sinclair Capital was absolute. The trading desks were locked, the phones were quiet, and the monitors showed only red error logs, flashing like warning lights in a sinking ship. The total open exposure had reached $80 million, and the second quarter losses were estimated at $140 million. Toby Fletcher called my personal phone at 8:03 in the morning. He sounded hollow, his voice cracking as he asked if I had a backup of the original failover parameters. He said Julian was locked in his office crying, and the founder, George, was flying back from Florida. I listened to the young quant panic, then I repeated the words that had been burned into my memory. Julian told me he did not pay me to think. I told Toby to update his resume, and then I hung up the phone. It was cold, but it was just. At 8:45, George Sinclair arrived at the office. The 63-year-old founder walked into the glass conference room where Julian and the board members were waiting. The confrontation was loud enough to be heard through the double-paned glass. George did not yell at first. He just looked at his son, trying to recognize the boy who had destroyed 11 years of work in less than a month. Then he snapped. He screamed that Julian had taken his legacy and turned it into a clown show. He slammed his fist on the glass table so hard that a tablet fell to the floor, his voice cracking with rage as the compliance officers showed him the forged signature logs. The regulatory hammer fell by noon. The Securities and Exchange Commission officially halted all trading operations at Sinclair Capital. The firm was insolvent, forced to liquidate its assets to cover the margin calls and the pending legal penalties. Julian was escorted from the building by security, his hands in his pockets and his head down, flanked by 2 crisis management lawyers. 2 weeks later, the final chapter was written. My new firm, Zenith Capital, quietly acquired the distressed assets and portfolios of Sinclair Capital for 11 cents on the dollar. Because the original contracts were void ab initio, we were able to purchase the core intellectual property of the Sentinel algorithm without any legal hurdles. The board of Zenith Capital assigned the integration project to one person, me. I sat in my new office 30 floors above the city and looked at the assignment memo on my screen. I clicked the button to open the repository. The familiar directory structure appeared, the same code I had spent 11 years writing. It was like finding an old friend who had been rescued from a fire. I laughed quietly, closed my eyes, and took a long, deep breath. I looked out at the Manhattan skyline, where the sun was breaking through the autumn clouds. I opened the code editor, ready to restore the safeguards and the manual thresholds that would make the system strong again. I smiled at the screen and said the words out loud to the empty room. I get paid to think. The transition of the distressed assets was completed within 2 weeks of the regulatory shutdown. Zenith Capital's acquisition of the portfolios was a masterclass in distressed asset buying. We purchased the intellectual property of Sentinel for 11 cents on the dollar, a tiny fraction of its true value. The legal team at Zenith was able to bypass the existing agreements because the forgery had rendered the original contracts void ab initio. The firm Sinclair Capital was dissolved, its name scrubbed from the building directory, and its employees scattered to other firms. George Sinclair went back to Florida, his legacy ruined by the son he had tried to protect. My first day working on the Sentinel integration was quiet. I sat in my office at Zenith, looking out at the city skyline. The sky was clear, and the wind was blowing the autumn leaves across the streets below. I opened the code repository, looking at the lines of code I had written over 11 years. It was a familiar landscape, but now it was free from the constraints of Sinclair Capital. I restored the volatility thresholds, integrated the failover manual parameters, and set up a new peer review process for the development team. The system was stable once again, running with the precision I had always intended. As I closed the laptop that afternoon, I felt a deep, profound sense of complete satisfaction and completion. The journey had been long, from the cramped office in Tribeca to the modern tower at Zenith Capital. I had faced public embarrassment, condescension, and betrayal. But I had stood firm by my boundaries, trusted my skills, and let the law do its work. The best revenge was not just seeing Julian fall. It was building a culture where technical expertise was respected, boundaries were honored, and engineers were recognized as the foundation of the firm's success. I walked out of the office, into the cool autumn air, ready to go home to my family, finally at peace.